Thanks very much, James. I'd just like to thank the Chief Minister and to the other James for the presentations. Lots to think about there. And what I would like to try to do is just bring this back to an Isle of Man perspective. As we've seen significant changes, particularly energy prices, which have directly affected the Isle of Man. And again, we've talked about the cost of living crisis. When does the crisis stop? Because what we've seen, these are the gas prices, massive peaks at the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which mirror some of the peaks in terms of the 1970s and geopolitics that drove oil prices up. But then what we saw was a complete change in terms of the oil production, going from OPEC far more to Canada, South America and North America. And so that's sort of managed to mediate some of that. But we've still got gas prices running about twice what they were before that. And that causes significant inflationary pressures later on in supply chains, particularly food, transport, and everything else going forward. And so on the Isle of Man, we've seen that surge of inflation. Again, that's partly due to energy prices, partly also due to other conflicts, particularly within the Conservative Party 3 years ago, which led to the Liz Truss budget, which had knock-on effects with the bond markets. So although we've seen that surge of inflation, and we've seen that inflation starting to come down, the real increase in prices is still there, which is why people feel worse off now than they did a couple of years ago. Yes, the metrics are getting better. Yes, the graphs are heading in the right direction, but people are still feeling worse off. Now, in August, Manx CPI was running at around about 3.3%. We've been tracking slightly less than the UK, and part of that is due to the Ofgem price cap in the UK and the way that skews their inflation figures. But here the inflation has mainly been driven by food, which, because we're a net importer, we can't be completely immune to, although we can invest in food security, transport, and also the cost of services, which has had that direct knock-on effect from increased energy prices and also the increase in interest rates as well. In this year's budget, which was in February, seems a long time ago now, what we tried to do was have that longer term viewpoint in terms of sustainable future and also growing government income at the same time as controlling expenditure and maximising the income on reserves as well to get that long-term budget security. Now, the OECD recently published their review of the last 2 years, and across the developed world, what we've seen is rising health expenditures and population ageing, prompting many governments to increase social security contributions. And looking at that longer trend about those welfare state protections that we've taken for granted, but are increasingly coming more and more expensive to provide, at the same time as James points out, that demographic change that's been sweeping through particularly developed nations has put extra strain. And then when you look at island communities, there are even more strain because of the fact that most of our young people leave the island, well, 50% leave the island to study, and we then have to try to entice them back. And so various countries have tried to bridge that gap in the short term through immigration, which then has led to further issues in terms of the economic benefit of immigration and societal changes, which then directly affects the political discourse about the way we drive our communities further and into the future. In this year's budget, we cut the tax rate from 22% to 21%. We increased personal allowances. And crucially, we did not increase the national insurance rate for employers. That's been credited with causing some of the lack of business confidence in the UK and driving up some of the inflation that they've seen in terms of wages, alongside some of the changes to the minimum wage that they brought in, and also some of the employment law changes they brought in. So those three contributors together have led to some stresses in the UK. However, if we are going to balance some of the stresses that our community have faced over the last couple of years, we need to increase the minimum wage. We need to improve worker rights and worker employment laws to balance that, because we're in an incredibly competitive environment to get those skills that we need to drive our economy. We also invested in healthcare and put extra money into Manx Care with contingency funding, and looked to put more money into the economic strategy, particularly looking at working families, driving a childcare strategy, looking at the skills strategy, and also back to work plans to try to deal with those people in our community who aren't actively working and contributing to our society. Because when you look at some of the demographic changes that we're going through around the world, but again, we're not immune to our island, we have an ageing population. We have inward and outward migration roughly balanced at the moment, according to our latest population report, but a declining birth rate, which again is very similar to other developed nations, but also actually a rising death rate as that older population cohort unfortunately come to the end of their life. We need to look at the proportion of the population who are actively working, whatever age they are. And also, as James has pointed out, that dependency ratio in terms of the number of people who are working versus the number of people who are retired and sometimes relying on the state to deal with those benefits. So when you look at these graphs, and all of this data is on the economic dashboard, which is a fascinating way of watching our economy in real time, the total claims for benefits is roughly stable. We've had roughly stable in terms of income support, roughly stable in terms of incapacity benefit, but then you look at maternity, paternity and child benefit going down, which is partly due to thresholds, but partly due to a decreased birth rate. At the same time as pensions going up in terms of the number of pensioners, you can see in real time that we are facing some of those pressures that James has talked about, although not to the same extent as South Korea with any luck. When you look at incapacity benefit claims, it's quite interesting on the Isle of Man. They've remained relatively stable, although in the United Kingdom they've seen an uprise, which has been attributed to long COVID. But we still have around about 1,500 people on the Isle of Man who are not in active employment. And so one of the things that Treasury are launching is a workforce reintegration program. We've tried to do it in the past, but this is really trying to make work worthwhile. It twins those employment law changes that we're bringing forward. It twins increasing the minimum wage, but it also brings in that support for people to get back into active employment, whether that's upskilling them, retraining them, making sure we've got the validated data to put the training in through the skills board and with its intrinsic relationship with the private sector, but also looking at a pilot program where we can look at some of these people who are between the age of 18 and 30 who are on long-term incapacity benefit, often due to mental health problems, and actually spend some time with them, working with them to get them back into employment. That is a way of trying to tap into what is a unused labour source at the moment to try to fill some of those skills gaps that we have without necessarily depending on inward migration, whether that's from the CTA or from outside it. In terms of our economy at the moment, as I said, inflation's running at about 3.3%. It often tracks the UK, but is on a downward curve at the moment. We have a relatively low level of people seeking employment on our island, less than 300, and that's remained relatively static. So we've got quite a dynamic workforce where, although we have seen some job losses in certain sectors, those people have been able to be re-employed in others. We have seen a reduction in the total number of vacancies on the Isle of Man. As often firms consolidate, look again at those long-term vacancies, but perhaps also look at upskilling and automation going forward to reduce their need for an increased workforce, but drive efficiencies within their companies. We've seen the private sector jobs and employment levelling off a little bit. I think that feeds into that the previous comment from James about companies looking for the medium term and saying, well, we'll just hold still at the moment, see how things go, weather the storm before we start investing to expand, because we don't quite know what the next headline will be. We've seen transport numbers up marginally since last year, but particularly with the TT this year and the Manx Grand Prix, they've been really quite successful. And there is a trade-off there between the rise in numbers using the steam packet company and a slight reduction in numbers using airlines because of some of the pressures on the schedules for some of the low-cost carriers. And we've also seen an uptake in terms of the housing market. We had the initial boom after COVID where everyone seemed to want to either downsize or upsize or move into the countryside. Prices went up quite considerably. The market became a little bit saturated and slowed down. Now people with the signs of reduced interest rates are looking again at investing in their properties or moving either way, either to upscale or downscale. We've recently published the updated financial position, and what Treasury are doing is on a quarterly basis doing this so people can see what the government finances are like in real terms. We are running at the moment a year-to-date slight deficit, which is mainly due to healthcare costs and their documented pressures that they've got, particularly with tertiary referrals and staffing. But in terms of the full year forecast, we're looking at income tax receipts above budget. We're looking at quite a healthy budget going forward, and also importantly using some of that to put back the investment income we get from reserves back into reserves. Our government reserves are currently £1.96 billion, and that's important because around the world government debt is seen as an existential threat to long-term prosperity. On the Isle of Man, we've been very careful to deal with that debt. Yes, we do have some bond issuances, but we also have sinking funds, bond repayment funds built in. We've recently gone through a re-examination of our investment strategy, which has led to significant increases in our reserves. And so when Moody's look at our prospects, whilst our Moody's rating is often twinned with the UK, they are forecasting healthy growth going forward. And note that we've got low debt, substantial reserves, and a track record of robust growth. However, we can't depend on future growth to grow us out of the inherent structural problems we have at the moment. But what we do need to do is capitalise on the diversification within our business community in terms of a small economy and actually make sure that we have those pragmatic long-term government policies that creates the right business environment for investment. In terms of the key budgetary pressures going forward, we've got any negative changes to our predicted income. Now, that can be an individual company going into financial difficulties or perhaps rebalancing where they want to be cited. But also there is that threat in terms of international comparisons and money val there that could have a detrimental effect to our economy. We've got the supply and services inflation, which are now fairly baked in and we need to start dealing with. We've got the increased demand in education and healthcare, which there's a whole range of causes for that. Some demographic, some genetic, some far more environmental. We've got public sector pay awards, again, in the UK and here as people try to rebalance what they've gone through over the last couple of years and are increasingly talking about increased pay above and beyond not just inflation but economic growth of those societies. That is a struggle. And we've got the overall cost of healthcare services, which increases year on year as new drugs and treatments become available. We can do more things now to help the human body than ever before. Also, one of the side effects of having a secure and strong border is that our prison capacity has increased. We need to deal with that. That is a net cost on a small island. But if we are to have that security, which now is seen as really part of the USP of the Isle of Man, that safety for our population, that needs some investment in terms of law enforcement, but also making sure that those people are kept off the streets for the safety of our community. Financial discipline remains a focus of everything we do because the key aspect of the job of Treasury is to make sure expenditure is within the allocated budgets and protect our reserves. So as I said, we've completed a new investment strategy to grow reserves, maximise income, but also put that back into those reserves. We're continuing the enhanced financial reviews on the individual departments with different scrutiny committees going forward, looking at their spending in real time, dealing with pressures in real time to reduce the end-of-year outturn. We're also providing financial support for all those departments when they need it, and also every single department is progressing efficiency plans in their own right to balance some of the significant pressures they've been facing, particularly in terms of specialist equipment and services brought from abroad. In terms of the efficiency programme, and you'll find out far more about this tomorrow, what government have done right across the piece is identified about £10.4 million of identified savings already. We've put more money into the transformation fund to help drive those efficiencies, but also looking increasingly at digitalisation and automation, looking at procurement, getting the best value for taxpayers' money, making sure that the government assets are realised and used in the right and efficient way, and also looking at recruitment controls and workforce analysis to drive better service delivery. There are lots of threats, but there are also significant opportunities for growth and productivity, particularly in a small island economy. We've talked already about the money value assessment and the regulatory environment, but we can use that for our best interests in terms of driving forward more innovative financial services. Connectivity and tourism have been key to the revised island plan, and tourism growing that, getting more people visiting the island, has always been an inherent part of our economy for the last 100 years. That's seeing a resurgence as people increasingly look to go closer to home, drive decent value, but also capitalising on our UNESCO biosphere status for ecotourism. There are significant opportunities in terms of skills training and also looking at managing migration so we get the right skills that we need to bridge those gaps that are there, but working very much with the private sector to identify the right skills to make sure that those fill those productivity gaps going forward. And that ties into that idea of national security and driving that forward in very much a uncertain world, that people on the Isle of Man feel safe. As several people have commented already, the future of AI and robotics is very exciting, particularly for a small island that relies on a relatively small skilled workforce, but can drive efficiency and productivity by looking not just at increasing the workforce, but by using new technologies. Burnbrae's announcement today that they're looking to invest almost £1 billion over the next 10 years in terms of looking at leasing AI and robotics is incredibly interesting in how it can pivot the Isle of Man and our existing financial services sector, looking at how that can provide access to these new technologies, not just here, but around the world. Infrastructure investment, particularly in housing and the key strategic infrastructure of the Isle of Man, will drive economic growth as well as increase and improve the quality of life of people living on the Isle of Man. But at the end of the day, what this government will do is make sure we get the right service delivery and outcomes for the people who live here. In terms of the key financial imperatives, really, we need to make sure that we work within allocated budgets, protect our reserves, but also have the right economic and political environment to enable growth in the private sector. And that's where we come down to some of the key imperatives, which are for right across government and right across Tynwald and our political system to drive that element of certainty, stability and confidence in the Isle of Man, which then give business and consumer confidence to drive our economy forward. And key to all that is what we're doing today, which is liaison and cooperating with key business sectors, making sure that government respond to the needs of people working in our community and running businesses in our community to drive that inward investment, get those long-term viewpoints in terms of how we can all work together. So I'd like to thank you for coming today. That we've had one speech, two presentations. Now is perhaps the more important time, which is that interaction in terms of questions and answers. And I look forward to being challenged on my presentation, as I'm sure James does on his. Thank you very much.